Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
I prepared a statement which will summarize some thoughts that I've been turning over in my mind lately. Thoughts on restitution, repatriation, provenance research, history of collections, and the interconnectedness of these fields. And these thoughts have come out of 4 years of comparative research on recent repatriation processes in Germany, Namibia, and Australia, and some other places. For the sake of clarity, I'll use the term repatriation to refer to the return of human remains, and by restitution, I mean mainly the return of artifacts, just to, distinguish the two, although I know there are overlaps. In the first part of my talk, I'll quickly recap the state of affairs in the human remains debate in Germany and relate it to the restitution debate. The second part will consist of some general observations about repatriation that I think may help to reflect on restitution as well. And the third part, I'll go back to the topics of the last 2 sessions, actually provenance research and the history of collections. And I'll argue that provenance research is not only a prerequisite of returns, but an aim in itself. So, first of all, the state of affairs in Germany 2015, the debate on the return of human remains and artifacts. Compared to the international arena, the repatriation debate in Germany has only gained momentum over the past few years, very much due to the repatriation claims advanced by Namibia and Australia after 2010 and the subsequent returns. And here you see an image of that return of human remains from the Charité to Namibia. And the second image is on the return of human remains from the Charité to Tasmania. As a consequence of these debates and processes, the German Museum Association has issued the already mentioned recommendations for the care of human remains in museums and collections in 2013, arguing for a proactive approach to provenance research and return. However, so far only the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz has issued a corresponding policy document, its so-called Grundsatzposition zum Umgang mit menschlichen Überresten in den Sammlungen der Staatlichen Museen zu Berlin, basic position on the care of human remains in the collections. And the SPK has also indicated that it will create a position for provenance research on human remains, as was reported to me, and I'd really be interested to know more about these plans. Maybe Hermann Partzinger can elaborate on that in the discussion. 3 things need to be borne in mind, I think. Firstly, the repatriation debate is particularly urgent for natural history or, for example, medical history museums and science museums, and for ethnographic museums that do hold anthropological collections like, for example, Bremen and Dresden. Otherwise, ethnographic museums are affected to a lesser extent. It's first and foremost ethnographic collections from New Zealand, including Toimoko preserved heads of Maori that are approached for repatriation. Secondly, in the meantime, repatriation is a relatively consensual field of engagement, I would say, and therefore it's also easier to make decisions in this field. Historical contexts of acquisition, for example, are less controversial. Human remains are not easily appropriable by the market, and I think Western and non-Western moralities concerning the care of human remains seem to have a greater overlap. So these are some of the reasons for the difference here. And thirdly, as a consequence, the debate on the return of human remains has progressed much more in comparison to the debate on artifacts. The latter, although constantly alive, has not produced many results in terms of policies or actual returns. I'm speaking about Germany here. Likewise, the arguments have not changed much since the 1970s and 80s, although there seems to be a more general awareness of returns and maybe sometimes also a cautious acceptance that these claims are articulated, at least. These are conclusions from a forthcoming study by anthropologist Sarah Frund, who did research in all German museums on restitution cases or restitution claims. And as you heard yesterday, there's also a detailed PhD project being carried out on two Cameroonian claims. But I want to argue here that we can still learn from repatriation processes for restitution, precisely because there's a growing body of experience with repatriation, in particular internationally. So what are the useful observations from comparative analysis of repatriation processes? What insights can we gain? My first argument is about the transcultural negotiations. Each country and community enters negotiations on returns with their distinct concerns about the history of colonialism and decolonization, about the redress of colonial injustices, about nation building, heritage preservation, about multi-ethnic societies, as well as with distinct ontological and spiritual concepts, religious and political practices. And this is, of course, not only true for the claimants, but also for the holding institutions in Europe. To my experience, curators of European institutions often consider these transcultural negotiations as extremely instructive and insightful as to how their counterparts think and work and discuss things. They are challenged to reflect upon their own approaches and upon meaningful ways of interaction. If curators feel that way, I would argue audiences will too. So I think there's a chance for talking more openly about these processes. Even myself as a researcher, I was quite struck by learning through repatriation processes how colonialism played out very differently in the different areas of the world, like Africa and Oceania and different countries in these regions. And this becomes very apparent and palpable in repatriation processes and how they are carried out. As a consequence, secondly, returns are highly dependent on the constellations of actors. There's no standard way of returning human remains or artifacts at the moment. While, for example, the Toy Moko of the Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt were released in a very small and private ceremony in 2011, the handover ceremony of Toy Moko in Paris in 2012 was turned into a semi-public national event, as you can see here. That's at the Musée des Quai Branly. Hence, museums engaging in returns are not passive bystanders on which indigenous protocols are imposed, but they have the possibility to co-author ceremonies and thereby to generally seek their own ways of dealing with this issue and also set precedents for their institutional practices in a post-colonial world. And this is particularly the case in Germany, where differently from France, no national legislation needs to be observed at the moment, but this might, of course, change with the new Kulturgüterschutzgesetz. So restitution and repatriation can be understood as an essential for post-colonial cross-cultural curating. Thirdly, in many instances, there have been offers by receiving delegations or institutions to maintain the relations that have been instigated on the occasion of the return. It's certainly not easy to turn these relations into long-term conversations, but I think the chance is there. As the South African historian Siraj Rasool has argued, return and repatriation are not events, but cultural processes that form new relationships. And here's an image from a repatriation ceremony in Vienna that Barbara Plankensteiner is going to talk about soon a bit more. My fourth point is engaging in restitution can be a starting point for rethinking one's own institutional practice. For example, when the human remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar were returned from the Vienna Natural History Museum to South Africa in 2012, the return was enacted as a rehumanization of the Pienaars. A series of rather complicated material, legal, bureaucratic measures were taken in order to return the bones of the pioneers back, turn them back into real corpses to be flown back to their home country. This threw in sharp relief the many processes of objectification that the pioneers had been subjected to more than 100 years ago. So the repatriation of the pioneers challenged established museum categories. Fifth, in various cases, historical provenance research conducted in the run-up to repatriations revealed related objects or subjects and brought researchers to investigate and unfurl the broader historical contexts of colonial collecting and of colonial science around 1900. For example, experience gained in the Charité Human Remains Project, and here you see the publication that was an outcome of that project. Experience gained in this project also facilitated the identification of Namibian human remains at the University of Jena and a subsequent provenance research project. The latter, in turn, resulted in a detailed discussion of the collection of the Zoological Museum in Jena and a reassessment of the role of zoology in Jena around 1900. So provenance research has proved to be not only a tool for substantiating or refuting claims, but I argue rather a means of understanding better the history of science, as well as the history of the humanities and the pertinent museums. The third part of my talk is about provenance research without or with or without restitution claims, solicited or unsolicited restitution, questions to be asked about the way forward. What could be the role of provenance research with or without the consequence of restitution in ethnographic museums of the 21st century? Firstly, I would say provenance research must take place independently of restitution claims. This important point has been made by Jürgen Zimmerer at the conference of the German Museum Association earlier this year. The importance of provenance research is sometimes played down with the argument that nobody is demanding certain objects back. I mean, actually, there are not so many cases in the German context. But I think that does not release us from the responsibility to better know what went into our collections, why and how. My second point is from provenance research to a broader and more in-depth historiography of collections. I argue for this broader type of historical research that goes beyond provenance research in the strict sense of the word. Provenance research is a means of establishing value and authenticity, ownership, legitimate or illegitimate circumstances of acquisition. I mean a type of historical research that not only attaches interesting anecdotes to select objects or lots as a narrative surplus, but a historical research that systematically inquires about the unmaking and unmaking of museum collections. A type of research that lays bare the many connections between collections of different ethnographic museums, connections between different types of museums, like, for example, ethnographic and natural history museums. We come across many collectors, donors of collections that gave collections to the Ethnographic Museum and the Natural History Museum likewise at the same time. And then I would also want to stress connections between museums, connections between collections in museums in Europe and in the post-colonial nation states that very often hold similar collections. And this point was made yesterday also with this nice slide of that one collection that went into, 15 or 16 different museums of the world. Such research could be a means of thinking and working through collections and of understanding the institution of the ethnographic museum better. In short, I think we need to further shift our attention from the representativeness of collections, representativeness of certain cultures, ethnic groups, regions, and topics, to the historicity and specificity of collections. Collections as a product of transnational asymmetrical encounters. I'm convinced that looking into the past of collections can guide us very well when envisioning a future for these collections. There is a question that, to my knowledge and to my surprise, has not been asked so far, even at this conference. If we wanted to systematically investigate the provenance of collections, and I really mean systematically, proactive, unprovoked, and not upon demand or anlassbezogen, as the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz phrased it in its response to the Kleine Anfrage by the party Linke. If we wanted to systematically investigate these collections, then how are we to do this? I think this is the main question that we have to really work on. Under which circumstances, politically, legally, ethically, and financially, would this be desirable and feasible? Which means and resources would have to be allocated? And how could we team up for this? And I think this was brought up earlier. We need to team up universities with collections. We need to team up European institutions with African institutions in the Global South where our collections are from. And I think we must really come up with strategies how we do this in order to be able to carry out the task of provenance research a bit more systematically. Which funding lines could be exploited more systematically or even set up for that? How can provenance research become an integral part of museum work? These are all very difficult questions, but I think we need to look into them. Wiebke Arndt mentioned that the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and Media, Monika Grütters, did stress at the annual meeting of the German Museum Association that in the long run, provenance research must include objects acquired in the colonial era. And I suggest we should not wait for politics to release money first, and then react. But we should get our arguments together now and articulate vis-à-vis politics, say the newly established Foundation German Center for Lost Cultural Property. You know, what would be needed, what is necessary, what can be done, what are the limits, what are the problems, and so on. And there are also, I think, practical concerns that ethnographic museums will have to emphasize that maybe don't come up in other areas of provenance research, for example, NS-era provenance research, like how can the knowledge be made available to institutions and initiatives in the countries of origin? And as was mentioned earlier in the discussion, there's also a difference maybe between the classical NS-era provenance research and ethnological provenance research, where other methods must be considered, like oral history research and so on. So my fourth point is learning from the Nazi, this was the center, yeah. Learning from Nazi-era provenance research. Although colonial collections are, of course, very different from those seized in the Nazi era, I suggest that we do look deeper into how Nazi-era provenance research was professionalized and institutionalized. The Arbeitskreis Provenienzforschung, Working Group for Provenance Research, founded in 2000 by four art historians, has played a vital role for the advancement of provenance research and also restitutions of looted art. And I'm convinced that a working group for colonial-era provenance research would make enormous sense in the context of ethnographic collections. We need, I think, more networking and more concerted efforts. Another interesting example that was mentioned earlier as well is the Department of Art History at the Freie University in Berlin, for example, offers a module entitled Provenance Research in their BA and MA program, as you can see on the right-hand side. So would that be an interesting perspective for students of anthropology as well? Would it help acquaint them with collections in the face of an anyway ongoing material turn and increasing interest in material culture? So these would be two examples where I think we really should look to what has been achieved so far in Nazi-era provenance research. My fifth point is public debate. I already mentioned this. I think there's a lot to be gained from going public on these issues. There have been a couple of efforts to talk about provenance research in temporary exhibitions, but I've not come across an exhibition yet that has dared to explicitly tackle the issue of repatriation or restitution. But I think if we don't talk about what we worry about, also in exhibitions, then where has our much praised self-reflexivity gone? And my last point is long-term models of cooperation in all three areas. Museum curator Burkhard Fenner from Rautenstrauch-Jost Museum in Cologne has argued that alongside the four traditional museum-related fields of work, research, collecting, preservation, and education, a fifth field has emerged, conducting negotiations on the demands and wishes of the societies whose cultural heritage ethnographic museums preserve. And I think such a five-field approach makes a great mission statement for the ethnographic museum of the 21st century. A starting point may be the formulation of policies concerning issues in our museums, as policies on provenance, research, restitution, and so on. And we could certainly look to other countries for inspiration. Australian museums have drawn up elaborate policy documents on provenance research, conditions for returns, and so on, and most of them are online. So there's plenty of international experience in this field. An advanced exercise will be joint research projects. Again, the Australian National University has just started a major research project called Return, Reconcile, Renew, with partners from New Zealand and USA. The project looks at the history and effects of repatriation and attempts at empowering community-based research and practice. Possibilities for joint research, globally accessible databases, whether we call this shared heritage or digital repatriation or whatever, alternative formats like traveling exhibitions and long-term loans that increase the accessibility of museum objects beyond European audiences. I think all these options must be explored more systematically. Also from our vantage point as a country that does not have such close relations to the Southern Hemisphere as exist, for example, within the Commonwealth. So maybe a second working group, I don't know. I'll stop reasoning here. I just hope that these few thoughts, even though they are not brand new, can serve as an impulse in our discussion on the role and potential of ethnographic collections in the 21st century. Thank you very much.